In the 1920s, American ranchers relied on 30 desserts made from fresh cream, beef tallow, and whatever fruit grew near the ranch house. These desserts were famous across America and beloved by millions. Then they all started vanishing without explanation. Number 1 requires stirring the filling with your bare finger. Number 4 uses melted chocolate poured over candles. Number 6 contains crushed potato chips. Let's rediscover these 30 forgotten rancher desserts that disappeared from American tables. Tyler pudding pie was named after a Texas rancher's wife in the late 1800s who perfected this obscure custard dessert in her ranch kitchen. The pie combines eggs, heavy cream, sugar, butter, and cornmeal to create a texture that sits somewhere between chess pie and smooth flan. The cornmeal gives it a slightly grainy, pudding-like consistency that sets it apart from regular custard pies. Ranch families made Tyler pudding pie when they had abundant fresh eggs and cream from their dairy cows, but no fruit available for cobblers or other desserts. The filling baked into a dense, sweet custard with a golden top. It was served warm in winter and cold in summer, sometimes topped with fresh whipped cream. By the 1940s, Tyler pudding pie had vanished from ranch tables and cookbooks entirely. Today, almost no one outside of old Texas ranch families has ever heard of it or tasted its unique cornmeal-thickened custard. Transparent pie earned its name from the way light passes through its glossy amber filling when held up to a window. This Kentucky ranch dessert dates back to the 1800s and became popular on cattle ranches across the South and Midwest. The filling uses only butter, sugar, eggs, cream, and a splash of vanilla, creating a clear, jewel-like custard once baked. Unlike opaque custard pies, transparent pie has a translucent quality because it contains no flour, cornmeal, or thickening agents. Ranch cooks appreciated how simple it was to make, with basic pantry staples and fresh dairy. The pie was typically served at holiday gatherings and special occasions because the glossy appearance looked elegant despite its humble ingredients. Transparent pie required careful baking at a low temperature to prevent curdling. By the mid-1900s, it had faded from ranch kitchens as commercially prepared desserts became more accessible and home baking declined.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
Jeff Davis pie has nothing to do with the Confederate president, despite sharing his name. This rich Southern dessert originated on ranches in Georgia and Alabama in the late 1800s and spread westward with migrating ranchers. The pie filling combines brown sugar, butter, eggs, cream, and warm spices like nutmeg and cinnamon into a dense, caramel-like custard. Some recipes add dates or raisins for texture, though ranch versions kept it simple. The name likely came from a ranch cook or local baker named Jeff Davis, not the historical figure. Ranch families served Jeff Davis pie during fall and winter when molasses and brown sugar were plentiful. The pie tasted similar to pecan pie, but without the nuts, making it cheaper and easier to prepare. It had a smooth, almost fudgy texture when cooled. By the 1950s, Jeff Davis pie had disappeared from most ranch tables, surviving only in a few old family cookbooks tucked away in attic trunks. Roy's batcake got its strange name from a Wyoming ranch cook named Roy, who served this intensely rich chocolate cake at the Covered Wagon Ranch in the early 1900s. The cake earned the Bat nickname because Roy only made it after dark during evening gatherings, and the dark chocolate color reminded cowboys of bats in the night sky. The recipe requires premium cocoa powder, coffee, and heavy cream ganache poured over the finished cake while still warm. Ranch hands considered Roy's bat cake the ultimate reward after long days working cattle. The ganache was so rich it had to be eaten in small portions. Roy topped each slice with salted chocolate shards that added crunch. The cake stayed moist for days because the coffee in the batter kept it from drying out. When Roy retired in the 1940s, he took the original recipe with him, and the cake vanished from the ranch until decades later when his family shared it. Potato chip cookies sound like a modern gimmick, but ranchers were making them as early as the 1920s, when commercial potato chips first became available in rural general stores. Ranch wives discovered that crushing potato chips into cookie dough added a salty crunch that perfectly balanced the sweetness. The recipe combines butter, sugar, eggs, flour, white chocolate chips, and 2 cups of coarsely crushed potato chips. The salt from the chips eliminates the need for added salt in the dough. These cookies became a ranch staple because potato chips were shelf-stable and always available, unlike nuts, which required shelling and preparation. The cookies baked into crispy, golden rounds with visible potato chip pieces throughout. Ranch kids loved them because they tasted like dessert and snack food combined. White Stallion Ranch in Arizona made these cookies famous among guests in the 1950s and 60s, but most home bakers outside the ranch stopped making them by the 1970s. Uri Hook 5 ranch desserts down. Tyler Pudding Pie, Transparent Pie, Jeff Davis Pie, Roy's Batcake, and potato chip cookies all disappeared because modern bakeries offered easier options. These desserts required fresh ranch ingredients and time most families no longer had. The next 5 lasted slightly longer, but still faded from ranch kitchens by the 1960s. S'mores bars were not invented at summer camp. Ranch versions appeared in the 1930s when marshmallows and chocolate became affordable for rural families. Vista Verde Ranch in Colorado perfected their recipe in the 1940s, turning campfire s'mores into a baked bar cookie that traveled well and stayed fresh for days. The recipe layers graham cracker pieces, mini marshmallows, chocolate chips, and Hershey's bar chunks into a brown sugar cookie dough. Unlike campfire s'mores that fall apart, these bars held together perfectly and could be packed in saddlebags or lunch tins. Ranch hands preferred them over regular s'mores because they were less messy and easier to eat while working. The bars baked into dense fudgy squares with pockets of melted chocolate and toasted marshmallow throughout. They were typically made a day ahead and refrigerated to make slicing easier. By the 1980s, commercial s'mores products replaced homemade ranch versions in most kitchens. Amaretto cheesecake became a signature dessert at Geronimo Trail Guest Ranch in New Mexico in the 1960s, when Italian liqueurs started appearing in rural liquor stores. The ranch adapted a traditional cheesecake recipe by adding amaretto liqueur to the cream cheese filling and brushing more liqueur over the finished cake. The almond-flavored liqueur gave the cheesecake a sophisticated flavor that impressed ranch guests. The recipe requires a graham cracker crust, cream cheese, eggs, sugar, vanilla, and a half cup of amaretto mixed into the batter. The cheesecake bakes in a water bath to prevent cracking, then cools overnight in the refrigerator. Before serving, each slice gets brushed with additional amaretto and topped with toasted sliced almonds. The combination of creamy cheesecake and almond liqueur made it a requested dessert for decades. Sugar cream pie originated with Indiana Amish communities in the 1800s and traveled west with ranchers who settled in Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. The pie earned the nickname finger pie because ranch cooks stirred the filling with their fingers during baking to prevent the bottom crust from breaking. The recipe requires only sugar, flour, cream, and butter, mixed directly in an unbaked pie shell. No eggs, no thickeners, just those 4 simple ingredients. The filling bubbles and thickens as it bakes, forming a dense, sweet custard with a slightly caramelized top. Ranch families made sugar cream pie during winter, when fruit was unavailable, but dairy was plentiful. The pie tasted rich and comforting, similar to crème brûlée but less refined. Indiana named it the official state pie in 2009, but by then most ranch families had forgotten how to make it. The finger-stirring technique has been completely lost outside of a few traditional Amish communities. Tres leches cake arrived on American ranches in the Southwest during the early 1900s, when Mexican ranch hands brought the recipe north from their home country. The name means 3 milks, because the cake gets soaked in a mixture of evaporated milk, sweetened condensed milk, and whole milk after baking. Upper Canyon Outfitters Guest Ranch in Colorado made it famous among American ranch visitors in the 1950s. The cake bakes light and spongy, then absorbs the milk mixture through holes poked across the top. After refrigerating overnight, the cake becomes incredibly moist and dense. It gets topped with sweetened whipped cream and a dusting of cinnamon before serving. Ranch families loved tres leches cake because the milk-soaked texture stayed fresh for days without drying out. The dessert requires minimal ingredients but produces an impressive result. Most American ranch families stopped making it once Mexican bakeries became common and store-bought versions were readily available. Oatmeal pie tastes like pecan pie without the pecans, and ranchers created it during the Great Depression when nuts were too expensive. The filling combines oats, corn syrup, brown sugar, butter, eggs, and vanilla into a sweet, chewy mixture that bakes into a caramel-like custard. Alisal Guest Ranch in California's Santa Ynez Valley made oatmeal pie their most requested dessert in the 1940s and still serves it today. The oats provide texture similar to chopped nuts, but cost almost nothing. Ranch cooks appreciated how shelf-stable oats were compared to perishable nuts that went rancid. The pie required no special ingredients beyond basic pantry staples found on every ranch. It baked into golden, glossy slices that tasted rich despite their humble origins. Coconut could be added for extra flavor and texture. Most home bakers outside ranches have never heard of oatmeal pie, and the recipe rarely appears in modern cookbooks, despite being delicious and economical. 10 ranch desserts gone. Tyler pudding pie, transparent pie, Jeff Davis pie, Roy's batcake, potato chip cookies, s'mores bars, Amaretto cheesecake, sugar cream pie, tres leches cake, and oatmeal pie all vanished when ranch families abandoned homemade desserts for store-bought convenience. The next 10 lasted longer but still disappeared. Sorghum cake was the southern ranch alternative to molasses cake, and it tasted completely different because sorghum syrup has a unique, grassy sweetness that blackstrap molasses lacks. Sorghum was a major crop across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas ranches in the late 1800s and early 1900s, grown specifically for its sweet juice that was boiled down into thick syrup. Every fall, ranch communities held sorghum-making parties, where neighbors gathered to harvest the cane, crush it in mills, and boil the juice in massive outdoor kettles. The resulting syrup was lighter and milder than molasses, with a distinctly earthy, almost buttery flavor. Sorghum cake used this syrup as the primary sweetener and flavoring agent. The recipe combined sorghum syrup with butter, eggs, flour, baking soda, and warm spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. Some versions added buttermilk or sour cream for extra moisture and tang. The batter was thick and fragrant, and it baked into a dense, moist, single-layer cake with a dark golden color. The cake was typically served plain or dusted with powdered sugar, though some ranch families topped it with whipped cream or a simple glaze. Sorghum cake was a fall and winter staple, baked when fresh sorghum syrup was available from the harvest. The flavor was complex and less aggressively sweet than cakes made with white sugar, with a slightly mineral, earthy undertone that some people loved and others found too strong. By the 1950s, sorghum production declined dramatically as corn syrup and refined sugar became cheaper and more convenient, and ranch families stopped making sorghum cake entirely. Buttermilk stack cake was not one cake, but rather 5 or 6 thin cake layers stacked with dried apple filling between each one, and it required days of preparation and patience. This Appalachian specialty originated in the mountains of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia in the 1800s, and it traveled west with ranchers who settled in Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas. The cake became a traditional wedding dessert in ranch communities too poor to afford fancy multi-tiered confections. Each wedding guest would contribute a single layer to the bride and groom's stack cake, and the number of layers reflected the couple's popularity in the community. The cake layers were made with buttermilk, flour, butter, eggs, molasses, and spices like ginger and cinnamon. Each layer was rolled thin and baked separately until firm but still pliable, resembling giant cookies more than traditional cake. Once all the layers were baked and cooled, they were stacked with thick apple butter or cooked dried apple filling spread between each one. The assembled cake was wrapped tightly and stored for at least 3 days, sometimes up to a week, to allow the apple butter to soften the layers and the flavors to meld together. During this aging process, the cake transformed from dry and stiff to moist and tender, with the apple butter soaking into the layers. Buttermilk stack cake tasted like spiced gingerbread combined with apple pie, dense and deeply flavorful. By the mid-1900s, as bakeries offered affordable multi-tiered white cakes with buttercream frosting, buttermilk stack cake seemed rustic and plain, and the multi-day preparation fell out of favor in modern ranch kitchens. Lane cake is an elaborate Southern dessert that became a Christmas tradition on wealthy ranches in Alabama, Georgia, and Texas, starting in the 1890s. Emma Rylander Lane created the original recipe in 1898, and it quickly spread to prosperous ranch families who could afford the expensive ingredients. Lane cake requires a white layer cake filled with a rich custard mixture containing egg yolks, sugar, butter, raisins, chopped pecans, shredded coconut, and bourbon whiskey. The filling cooks on the stove until thick, then gets spread between each cake layer while still warm. The finished cake is typically covered with a simple white frosting or 7-minute icing. What makes Lane cake special is the bourbon-soaked fruit and nut filling that tastes like liquid gold between the tender white cake layers. Ranch families only made Lane cake for Christmas, weddings, and significant celebrations because the ingredients were costly and the preparation time-consuming. The bourbon preserved the filling and added depth of flavor, though some ranch families substituted apple cider or grape juice in dry counties. Lane cake became so associated with Southern culture that Harper Lee featured it in To Kill a Mockingbird, cementing its place in American literature. Despite this fame, Lane cake began disappearing from ranch tables in the 1960s when elaborate layer cakes fell out of fashion and home baking declined. The cake required skill to assemble properly, and most modern bakers found it too complicated. Today, Lane cake survives mainly in historical Southern cookbooks and among dedicated bakers who preserve traditional recipes, but it has vanished entirely from everyday ranch kitchens across America. Egg custard pie was the simplest dessert ranch families could make when they had nothing but eggs, milk, sugar, and a pie crust. This humble pie dates back to medieval England, but became a ranch staple in America during the 1800s, when dairy cows and chickens provided abundant fresh ingredients. The filling requires only eggs, whole milk or cream, sugar, vanilla, and a pinch of nutmeg mixed together and poured into an unbaked pie shell. The pie bakes slowly at a low temperature until the custard sets into a smooth, silky filling that jiggles slightly when moved. Ranch cooks knew the pie was done when a knife inserted near the center came out clean. Egg custard pie had to be watched carefully because overcooking caused the custard to curdle and weep, creating an unappetizing texture. The finished pie tasted delicate and subtly sweet, with the nutmeg providing a warm spice note. Ranch families served egg custard pie warm in winter and chilled in summer, and it was considered appropriate for breakfast, dessert, or an afternoon snack. Children loved the smooth, creamy texture, and ranch wives appreciated how quickly it could be assembled. The pie used staple ingredients that never went bad, making it reliable when fresh fruit was unavailable. By the 1950s, egg custard pie began disappearing as convenience desserts, like instant pudding and store-bought pies, became widely available. The delicate custard seemed old-fashioned, compared to richer, more exciting desserts, and most modern bakers have never tasted a proper homemade egg custard pie with its gentle sweetness and silky texture. Sour cream raisin pie was a ranch kitchen staple in the Midwest and Great Plains during the early 1900s, when sour cream was abundant and raisins provided the only affordable dried fruit. This pie combined thick sour cream with plump raisins, eggs, sugar, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg into a rich, tangy filling. Ranch wives soaked the raisins in hot water before adding them to the filling to make them soft and juicy. The mixture cooked on the stovetop until thickened, then was poured into a pre-baked pie shell and topped with meringue made from the leftover egg whites. The meringue was browned in the oven, creating dramatic peaks that impressed ranch guests. Sour cream raisin pie tasted like a cross between custard pie and cheesecake, with the tartness of the sour cream balancing the sweetness of the raisins and sugar. Ranch families made this pie year-round because sour cream and raisins were always available, unlike seasonal fruit. The pie was served at community gatherings, church socials, and holiday meals throughout ranch country. Some versions added chopped walnuts or a splash of vanilla for extra flavor. The combination of creamy, tangy filling and fluffy meringue made sour cream raisin pie memorable to anyone who tasted it. By the 1970s, the pie had nearly vanished as tastes shifted away from raisin-based desserts and meringue-topped pies fell out of fashion. Today, sour cream raisin pie exists only in old ranch family cookbooks and among elderly bakers who remember making it in their childhood kitchens. 15 ranch desserts erased. Sorghum cake required harvesting cane. Buttermilk stack cake needed days of aging. Lane cake cost too much. Egg custard pie seemed too plain. Sour cream raisin pie lost popularity. These desserts required patience and ranch ingredients most families no longer had access to after the 1960s. Medicine Bow Mud Pie became the signature frozen dessert at Medicine Bow Lodge in Wyoming's Medicine Bow National Forest, starting in the 1970s, when the ranch wanted a show-stopping dessert for guests. This elaborate layered pie requires chocolate wafer cookies crushed and mixed with melted butter for the crust, which gets baked and cooled completely. The next layer is coffee ice cream, spread carefully over the crust and frozen solid for at least 2 hours. Then comes a fluffy layer made by whipping heavy cream and folding in marshmallow cream, which is spread over the frozen ice cream and returned to the freezer. Finally, melted chocolate is poured over the entire frozen dessert and spread gently to create a smooth chocolate shell. The finished pie gets garnished with whipped cream and chocolate shavings before serving. Medicine Bow Mud Pie earned its name from the dark, muddy appearance created by the chocolate cookie crust and chocolate topping. The combination of crunchy chocolate base, creamy coffee ice cream, fluffy marshmallow layer, and hard chocolate shell created multiple textures in every bite. Ranch guests requested the recipe constantly, and it became so popular that other dude ranches across the West started creating their own versions. The pie had to be made at least a day ahead to allow proper freezing time between layers. By the 1990s, Medicine Bow Mud Pie had inspired commercial frozen mud pies sold in grocery stores, but these mass-produced versions lacked the homemade quality and distinct coffee flavor that made the original ranch version special. Denver cheesecake was the pride of Elk Mountain Ranch in Colorado's San Isabel National Forest, where ranch cooks perfected this massive cheesecake recipe in the 1960s to feed groups of hungry ranch guests. Unlike New York-style cheesecake, Denver cheesecake uses a combination of cream cheese, eggs, heavy whipping cream, sugar, flour, lemon zest, and vanilla to create an incredibly rich and dense filling. The recipe makes enough batter to fill 2 springform pans, each requiring 2.5 pounds of cream cheese. The graham cracker crust is pressed into the bottom of each pan and pre-baked before adding the filling. What makes Denver cheesecake unique is the baking method. Each pan gets covered with aluminum foil and placed in a water bath, then baked at 500 degrees for only 10 minutes before the temperature drops to 200 degrees for another 70 to 80 minutes. This technique creates a perfectly smooth top without cracks. After baking, the cheesecakes cool under metal bowls to prevent sudden temperature changes that cause cracking. The finished cheesecakes are dense, creamy, and incredibly smooth, with a subtle lemon flavor that brightens the richness. Elk Mountain Ranch served Denver cheesecake plain or with fresh berry compote on the side. The recipe became so requested that the ranch shared it with guests who wanted to recreate it at home. By the 2000s, most home bakers found the recipe too intimidating because of the large quantity and precise baking technique, and Denver cheesecake remained primarily a Dude Ranch specialty rather than an everyday dessert. Strawberry pie with fresh berry glaze became a summer tradition at Red Horse Mountain Ranch and other western ranches starting in the 1950s, when refrigeration made fresh strawberries more accessible in rural areas. This pie is completely different from strawberry jam pie or strawberry cream pie. The technique requires a pre-baked pie crust spread with a thin layer of cream cheese on the bottom, then lined with halved fresh strawberries placed cut side down. The glaze is made by pureeing fresh strawberries and straining them to remove seeds, then adding just enough water to make 1¼ cups of liquid. This strawberry water gets combined with sugar, cornstarch, and salt in a saucepan and cooked while stirring constantly until it thickens and becomes clear, meaning the cornstarch has cooked out completely. Lemon juice is stirred in at the end. The hot glaze gets poured over the strawberries in the pie shell, completely covering every berry. The pie must be covered with plastic wrap directly on the surface and refrigerated for several hours until the glaze sets into a glossy, jewel-like coating. The finished pie looks stunning, with the bright red strawberries suspended in clear glaze. Ranch families made strawberry pie only during peak strawberry season when the berries were sweet and affordable. The combination of fresh berries, tangy cream cheese, and sweet glaze made it a favorite at ranch gatherings. By the 1980s, most families switched to easier strawberry pies using Jell-O or pudding mix, and the fresh berry glaze technique was largely forgotten outside of traditional ranch kitchens. Caramel cake with cooked frosting was the ultimate celebration dessert on southern ranches from the 1800s through the 1950s, reserved for weddings, Christmas, and significant birthdays. The cake itself is a simple yellow butter cake, but the frosting is what makes it legendary. True caramel frosting requires cooking sugar, butter, and cream on the stovetop until it reaches exactly the right temperature and color, then beating it as it cools until it reaches spreading consistency. The timing is critical, because if the mixture cooks too long, it becomes hard candy, and if it does not cook long enough, it stays runny and slides off the cake. Ranch cooks learned through experience to recognize the exact moment when the caramel was ready, watching for the mixture to turn deep amber and coat the back of a spoon. The frosting had to be spread quickly once it reached the right consistency because it continued to firm up as it cooled. A properly made caramel cake had thick, glossy frosting with a deep, butterscotch flavor that tasted nothing like modern caramel made from condensed milk. The frosting formed a slightly crisp outer layer while staying creamy inside. Ranch families often made caramel cake days before serving to allow the flavors to develop and the frosting to set completely. By the 1960s, most home bakers abandoned cooked caramel frosting because it required constant attention and precise timing that busy modern families could not spare. Store-bought caramel frosting and cake mixes replaced the homemade version, and the art of making true cooked caramel frosting nearly disappeared from ranch kitchens entirely. Blackberry cobbler was the most anticipated summer dessert on ranches across America because wild blackberries grew abundantly along fences, creeks, and unused pastures. Ranch families sent children out with buckets to pick berries in late summer, and the thorny bushes often left scratches on arms and legs that were considered worth the reward. Fresh blackberries were tossed with sugar and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken the juices, then poured into a deep baking dish. The topping varied by region and family tradition. Some ranch cooks made biscuit dough and dropped spoonfuls over the berries, while others rolled out pie dough and laid it across the top. Texas ranches often used a cake-like batter poured over the berries that baked into a golden crust. The cobbler baked until the filling bubbled around the edges and the topping turned golden brown. Ranch families served blackberry cobbler warm with heavy cream poured over the top, or a scoop of hand-cranked vanilla ice cream. The combination of tart blackberries and sweet topping made it irresistible. Blackberry cobbler appeared at every summer gathering, from ranch cookouts to church potlucks. Some ranch wives froze berries to make cobbler during winter months, when fresh fruit was unavailable. By the 1980s, as wild berry picking declined and store-bought frozen berries became common, peach cobbler reigned as the undisputed king of ranch desserts from Texas to California throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, and nearly every ranch family had their own closely guarded recipe passed down through generations. Peach trees thrived in ranch country, especially across Texas, Oklahoma, and the Southwest, where the hot summers produced sweet, juicy fruit perfect for baking. Ranch families planted small peach orchards near their homes, and the trees required minimal care while producing abundant harvests every summer. When peach season arrived in July and August, ranch kitchens transformed into canning and baking operations as families rushed to preserve the fruit before it spoiled. Peach cobbler was the simplest and most beloved way to use fresh peaches. Ranch cooks peeled and sliced ripe peaches, tossed them with sugar, a squeeze of lemon juice, and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken the juices, then arranged them in a cast-iron skillet or deep baking dish. The topping varied dramatically, depending on regional traditions and family preferences. Southern ranch families made buttermilk biscuit dough and dropped generous spoonfuls over the peaches, creating a rustic, bumpy top that baked into golden biscuits. Western ranches often used a simple cake batter poured over the fruit that baked into a smooth, golden crust. Some ranch cooks rolled out pie dough and draped it over the peaches like a blanket, cutting slits for steam to escape. The cobbler baked in a hot oven until the peaches bubbled furiously around the edges and the topping turned deep golden brown. The smell of baking peach cobbler filled the entire ranch house and drew family members from across the property. Ranch wives competed informally to see whose cobbler was the best, and certain women became legendary for their perfect peach cobbler. The dessert was so central to ranch culture that cowboys working summer cattle drives specifically requested peach cobbler when passing near towns with bakeries. Apple cobbler served as the fall and winter counterpart to summer's peach cobbler on ranches across America. Unlike peaches, which had a brief summer season, apples could be stored in cool cellars or root houses for months, providing fresh fruit through winter when nothing else was available. Ranch families planted multiple apple varieties to ensure a long harvest season and diverse flavors for cooking. Tart apples like Granny Smith, Winesap, and Jonathan were preferred for cobbler because their firm flesh held up during baking and their tartness balanced the added sugar. Ranch cooks peeled, cored, and sliced apples, then tossed them with white or brown sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, and sometimes a handful of raisins for extra sweetness. A bit of butter dotted over the apples added richness. The spiced apples were arranged in a baking dish, and the topping was added according to family tradition. Biscuit-style toppings were common in the South and Midwest, while cake batter toppings dominated in Texas and the West. Some ranch families made a crumb topping with flour, butter, brown sugar, and oats that baked into a crispy, streusel-like crust. Apple cobbler baked until the apples were tender and the juices thickened into a syrupy sauce. The cobbler was served warm with thick cream, a slice of sharp cheddar cheese, or vanilla ice cream. The combination of warm spiced apples and cold cream or cheese created a perfect balance of flavors and temperatures. Apple cobbler appeared on ranch tables throughout fall and winter, often replacing pie because it required less precision and could be assembled quickly when unexpected guests arrived. The dessert was especially popular during the holidays when ranch families gathered for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners. Apple cobbler could feed a crowd from a single large pan, making it practical for large ranch families and gatherings. Ranch children loved helping peel apples, and the annual apple harvest was a social event where neighbors gathered to process bushels of fruit together. By the 1990s and 2000s, as commercial apple pies and pre-made cobblers filled grocery store freezers, fewer ranch families bothered making apple cobbler from scratch. Rice pudding was one of the most economical and reliable desserts ranch families could make, because rice was shelf-stable, inexpensive, and always available at general stores, even in remote areas. This humble dessert dates back centuries in European cooking, but it became a ranch staple in America during the late 1800s, when rice production expanded and prices dropped low enough for working families to afford it regularly. Ranch cooks made rice pudding on the stovetop by simmering rice in milk with sugar, butter, and vanilla until the rice absorbed the liquid and became creamy and tender. The key to perfect rice pudding was patience and constant stirring to prevent the milk from scorching on the bottom of the pot. Ranch wives often made rice pudding in the evening after dinner, while cleaning the kitchen, letting it simmer slowly while they worked. The pudding thickened as it cooled, transforming from a soupy mixture into a creamy, spoonable dessert. Some ranch families added raisins, cinnamon, or nutmeg for extra flavor, while others kept it plain and simple. Rice pudding was served warm in winter and chilled in summer, making it versatile for year-round enjoyment. Ranch children loved rice pudding because the texture was comforting and familiar, and it was sweet enough to feel like a treat, but not so rich that it caused stomach aches. Ranch families made enormous pots of rice pudding to feed large families and ranch hands, and leftovers kept well in the icehouse or refrigerator for several days. The dessert was considered appropriate for breakfast, afternoon snacks, or dessert, making it one of the most versatile sweets in the ranch kitchen. Rice pudding appeared at community gatherings and church socials because it could be transported easily and served at room temperature without losing quality. Bread pudding exemplified the ranch philosophy of waste nothing, and it transformed stale, hardened bread that would otherwise be thrown away into a rich, comforting dessert that ranch families craved. Every ranch kitchen accumulated leftover bread ends, dried-out biscuits, and stale rolls that were too hard to eat but too valuable to discard. Ranch cooks collected these bread scraps in a bowl or bag, and when enough accumulated, they made bread pudding. The process was simple, but required time. Stale bread was torn into chunks and placed in a buttered baking dish, then soaked in a custard mixture made from eggs, milk or cream, sugar, vanilla, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. Some ranch families added raisins, chopped apples, or dried fruit for extra sweetness and texture. The bread absorbed the custard, swelling and softening as it sat. The pudding baked slowly in a moderate oven until the custard set and the top developed a golden, slightly crispy crust. The finished bread pudding had a texture between cake and custard, with the bread pieces creating pockets of soft, custardy interior surrounded by crispy edges. Ranch families served bread pudding warm with heavy cream, whiskey sauce, or caramel sauce poured over the top. The dessert was incredibly filling and satisfying, providing substantial calories that ranch workers needed after long days of physical labor. Bread pudding appeared frequently on ranch tables because it cost almost nothing to make and used ingredients that were always available. The dessert was flexible enough to accommodate whatever bread was on hand, from white sandwich bread to cornbread to leftover biscuits. Some ranch cooks even used leftover cake or sweet rolls, creating an extra rich version. Bread pudding was served at breakfast, afternoon snacks, or dessert, and leftovers could be reheated or eaten cold. The dessert became especially popular during winter months, when fresh fruit was unavailable and ranch families relied on pantry staples. Bread pudding also appeared at community gatherings because it fed crowds inexpensively and transported well without falling apart. Ranch children loved finding the raisins or fruit pieces hidden in their servings, and the sweet cinnamon-scented pudding was considered a special treat despite its humble origins. By the 1980s and 1990s, as sliced bread became cheaper and families stopped saving stale bread, bread pudding became less common on ranch tables. Modern families preferred throwing away stale bread rather than accumulating it for pudding, and the frugal mindset that made bread pudding necessary faded with increasing prosperity. Hand-cranked ice cream was not just dessert on ranches. It was a social event that brought families and communities together on hot summer evenings when the day's work was finished. The ice cream maker was a wooden bucket with a metal canister inside, and making ice cream required ice, rock salt, cream, sugar, and strong arms willing to crank the handle for 20 to 30 minutes. Ranch families who owned dairy cows had access to abundant fresh cream, making ice cream affordable despite the cost of ice and salt. Ice was the limiting factor, because ranches far from towns had no reliable source except winter ice harvested from frozen ponds and stored in insulated ice houses packed with sawdust. Making ice cream was therefore a special occasion reserved for summer celebrations, birthdays, 4th of July, and Sunday gatherings. The process began with mixing heavy cream, sugar, eggs, and vanilla in the metal canister, though recipes varied by family tradition. Some ranches made Philadelphia-style ice cream without eggs, while others made custard-based French-style ice cream that was richer and smoother. The canister was placed inside the wooden bucket, and layers of crushed ice and rock salt were packed around it. The salt lowered the freezing point of the ice, allowing it to get cold enough to freeze the cream mixture. Someone, usually the oldest child or a strong ranch hand, began cranking the handle slowly but steadily, rotating the canister inside the ice bath. As the mixture froze, cranking became increasingly difficult, and the job was often passed from person to person as arms tired. The entire process took 30 to 45 minutes, during which families sat together on the porch talking, laughing, and anticipating the finished product. When the handle became too difficult to turn, the ice cream was ready. The canister was removed, wiped clean, and opened to reveal perfectly smooth, creamy ice cream. Ranch families ate hand-cranked ice cream immediately because without modern freezers, it would melt quickly. Everyone gathered with bowls and spoons, and the ice cream was served in generous portions, often topped with fresh fruit, chocolate sauce, or crushed cookies. The flavor was incomparably rich and creamy, far superior to anything available in stores, and the texture was smooth without the ice crystals that form in commercial ice cream. Hand-cranked ice cream became a centerpiece of ranch social life, and families planned gatherings around ice cream making. By the 1950s and 1960s, as electric refrigerators with freezers became standard in ranch homes and store-bought ice cream became widely available, hand-cranked ice cream makers disappeared from most ranches. 25 ranch desserts forgotten. Peach cobbler, apple cobbler, rice pudding, bread pudding, and hand-cranked ice cream all vanished when convenience replaced tradition. Orchards disappeared. Stale bread got thrown away. Ice cream came from stores. The last 5 desserts were the most common, but still could not survive modern life. Oreo ice cream became a signature dessert at Elk Mountain Ranch in Colorado during the 1970s, when ranch cooks discovered that crushing Oreo cookies into homemade ice cream created a dessert that ranch guests requested constantly. This was not store-bought Oreo ice cream, but rather a from-scratch version that required making the ice cream base by hand and folding in crushed cookies at the end. The recipe combined heavy whipping cream, sugar, vanilla extract, lemon juice, and canned evaporated milk in a large bowl, mixing until everything was fully incorporated. The mixture was poured into a traditional hand-cranked or electric ice cream maker surrounded with ice and rock salt, and churned until thick and frozen. The churning process took about 20 to 30 minutes, during which the mixture transformed from liquid to soft-serve consistency. Once the ice cream reached the right texture, crushed Oreo cookies were thoroughly mixed in by hand using a large spoon or spatula. The cookies had to be crushed into various sizes, some fine crumbs for texture and some larger chunks for people to discover while eating. The finished ice cream was transferred to a storage container and placed in the freezer to firm up completely. Oreo ice cream tasted dramatically different from the commercial version because the homemade base was richer and creamier, made with real cream and evaporated milk instead of stabilizers and artificial ingredients. The cookies stayed crunchy in some bites and softened into the ice cream in others, creating textural variety. Ranch guests loved Oreo ice cream so much that Elk Mountain Ranch served it at nearly every meal during summer months. The dessert became so popular that other dude ranches across the West began making their own versions, each with slight variations in the base recipe or the amount of cookies added. Some ranches experimented with different cookie types, creating variations like chocolate chip cookie ice cream or peanut butter cookie ice cream, but Oreo remained the most requested. Making homemade Oreo ice cream required access to an ice cream maker, which most ranch families owned during the mid-20th century, but which became less common as store-bought ice cream improved in quality and variety. By the 1990s and 2000s, when premium ice cream brands like Ben & Jerry's and Breyers offered high-quality Oreo ice cream in every grocery store, most ranches stopped making it from scratch. The convenience of buying excellent ice cream without the labor of churning and cleaning equipment was too appealing to resist. Strawberry shortcake was the quintessential early summer dessert on ranches across America. From the 1800s through the 1960s, the strawberries were sliced fresh and mixed with sugar, then left to sit at room temperature for at least an hour to allow the berries to release their juices and create a sweet, syrupy sauce. Meanwhile, ranch cooks made rich buttermilk biscuit dough using flour, baking powder, butter, sugar, and buttermilk, sometimes adding a touch of nutmeg for warmth. The dough was rolled thick and cut into large rounds, then baked until golden and slightly crisp on the outside while remaining tender inside. Elk Mountain Ranch in Colorado became famous for their strawberry shortcake recipe that used an especially rich biscuit made with eggs and extra butter, creating an almost cake-like texture while maintaining the biscuit structure. But the results were worth the effort. The dessert could not be made ahead or transported easily, which made it special and anticipated. By the 1970s and 1980s, as commercial sponge cake, shortcakes, and frozen strawberries became widely available. Most families abandoned the traditional biscuit version. Store-bought pound cake or angel food cake replaced homemade biscuits, and Cool Whip replaced real whipped cream, creating a completely different dessert that was easier but inferior in flavor. Banana pudding became a ranch kitchen staple in the early 1900s when railroads made fresh bananas accessible and affordable in rural areas for the first time in American history. Before reliable transportation, bananas were exotic luxuries that most ranch families never tasted. But by the 1920s and 1930s, bananas appeared regularly in general stores across ranch country. Ranch cooks discovered that layering sliced bananas with vanilla pudding and cookies created a dessert that was both impressive and economical. Traditional ranch banana pudding was nothing like the modern version, made with instant pudding and Cool Whip. Ranch wives made real vanilla custard from scratch on the stovetop, using milk, egg yolks, sugar, flour, butter, and vanilla extract. The custard had to be stirred constantly to prevent scorching and cooked until thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. While the custard cooled slightly, vanilla wafer cookies were arranged in a layer on the bottom of a baking dish. Sliced bananas were placed over the cookies, and warm custard was poured over everything. The process was repeated to create multiple layers, ending with custard on top. The traditional finishing touch was meringue, made from the leftover egg whites whipped with sugar until stiff peaks formed. The meringue was spread over the top of the pudding, making sure to seal it to the edges to prevent shrinking. Then the entire dish was placed in the oven just long enough to brown the meringue peak. The finished banana pudding was stunning, with dramatic swirls of golden brown meringue on top. Dessert had to be refrigerated for several hours, or overnight, to allow the cookies to soften and the flavors to meld together. When served, each spoonful contained layers of soft cookie, sweet banana, creamy custard, and fluffy meringue. The texture was smooth and comforting, and the flavors were perfectly balanced between sweet and vanilla-rich. Banana pudding became a favorite at ranch gatherings, church socials, and Sunday dinners because it could be made in large quantities and served cold, making it practical for feeding crowds. Ranch families made banana pudding year-round because bananas and the other ingredients were always available and inexpensive. The dessert was especially popular in southern ranch states like Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, where it became a cultural icon. By the 1960s and 1970s, as instant vanilla pudding mix and frozen whipped topping became widely available, most ranch families abandoned the from-scratch method. The new version was faster and easier, requiring no cooking and no meringue-making skills, but it lacked the depth of flavor and rich texture that characterized traditional banana pudding. The meringue-topped version faded almost entirely, surviving only among older cooks who remembered making it the traditional way and among Southern bakers who refused to compromise on quality. Divinity candy was the ultimate test of a ranch cook's skill because this fluffy white candy required perfect weather, precise timing, and strong arms willing to beat egg whites for what felt like forever. Divinity originated in the South during the late 1800s and spread to ranches across America, becoming a traditional Christmas candy that appeared on ranch tables every December. The candy earned its name from its cloud-like appearance and melt-in-your-mouth texture that seemed almost heavenly. Making Divinity required only a few ingredients: sugar, corn syrup, water, egg whites, vanilla, and chopped pecans or walnuts. But the technique was unforgiving. The process began by cooking sugar, corn syrup, and water together in a heavy saucepan until the mixture reached exactly 260 degrees Fahrenheit on a candy thermometer, known as the hardball stage. Meanwhile, egg whites were beaten to stiff peaks using a hand mixer or by hand with a wire whisk, which required significant arm strength and patience. When the sugar syrup reached the correct temperature, it was slowly poured into the beaten egg white, continuing to beat constantly. The hot syrup cooked the egg whites and transformed the mixture into a thick, glossy, marshmallow-like candy. Vanilla extract and chopped nuts were beaten in at the end. The mixture had to be beaten until it lost its gloss and held its shape when dropped from a spoon, which could take 10 to 15 minutes of continuous beating. Working quickly before the candy hardened, ranch cooks dropped spoonfuls onto waxed paper, creating fluffy white mounds studded with nuts. The candy had to cool completely before being stored in airtight containers. Divinity succeeded only on dry, low-humidity days because moisture in the air prevented the candy from setting properly, causing it to remain sticky and impossible to handle. Ranch families learned through experience that Divinity could not be made during rainy weather or humid summers, restricting it to winter months when the air was dry. The finished candy was pure white, incredibly light and fluffy, and melted almost instantly on the tongue, leaving behind a sweet vanilla flavor and crunchy nuts. Divinity became a Christmas tradition because the cold, dry winter air provided perfect conditions for candy making. Ranch wives made batches of Divinity to give as gifts to neighbors, teachers, and friends, and the candy appeared on every holiday dessert. Making successful Divinity was considered a badge of honor among ranch cooks, and women who consistently produced perfect batches were admired and envied. By the 1980s and 1990s, as candy-making skills faded and store-bought candies became widely available, fewer ranch families bothered making Divinity. The finicky nature of the candy and the physical effort required made it seem impractical in modern kitchens. Divinity faded from ranch tables except among dedicated candy makers who continued the tradition. Chocolate cake was the most requested, most beloved, and most frequently baked dessert on ranches across America from the moment cocoa became affordable in the early 1900s through the present day. Unlike the obscure and forgotten desserts that filled this list, chocolate cake never disappeared and never went out of style, which is precisely why it appears last. Ranch families baked chocolate cake for every celebration, from birthdays to weddings to Sunday dinners to community gatherings. The cake represented stability, comfort, and guaranteed satisfaction in a world where food trends came and went. Traditional ranch chocolate cake was a simple 2- or 3-layer cake made with cocoa powder, flour, sugar, eggs, milk, butter, baking soda, and sometimes coffee to intensify the chocolate flavor. The batter was divided between round pans and baked until a toothpick inserted in the center came out clean. Once cooled, the layers were filled and frosted with chocolate buttercream, fudge frosting, or sometimes a simpler powdered sugar glaze. Ranch versions of chocolate cake were never fancy or elaborate. They did not involve multiple fillings, complex decoration, or exotic ingredients. They were honest, straightforward cakes that tasted deeply of chocolate and satisfied completely. Ranch families baked chocolate cake in cast-iron skillets, sheet pans, bundt pans, and layer cake pans depending on the occasion and available equipment. The cake appeared on ranch tables more frequently than any other dessert because it was reliable, beloved by children and adults alike, and appropriate for any occasion. Ranch wives kept their chocolate cake recipes written on index cards, in the margins of cookbooks, or memorized in their heads after making it hundreds of times. Each family had slight variations. Some added sour cream for moisture, others used buttermilk for tang, some preferred dark cocoa, while others used milk chocolate. These small differences made each ranch's chocolate cake unique while maintaining the essential character that made it universally loved. Chocolate cake survived every food trend, every economic depression, every shift in American baking culture because it was too beloved to abandon. When other desserts disappeared because they were too labor-intensive, too old-fashioned, or too unusual, chocolate cake remained because it was perfect exactly as it was. Ranch families continued baking chocolate cake through the Depression, both world wars, the convenience food revolution of the 1950s, and the gourmet food movement of the 1980s. Cake adapted to boxed mixes when they became available but never lost its identity. 30 ranch desserts, from Tyler pudding pie to chocolate cake. 29 vanished because modern life replaced homemade traditions with store-bought convenience. Ranch families stopped harvesting sorghum, aging stack cakes for a week, and hand-cranking ice cream on summer evenings. Fresh orchards disappeared. Stale bread got thrown away instead of becoming pudding. Only chocolate cake survived because it was too beloved to abandon. These desserts were not just food. They were ranch life itself, made from fresh cream, beef tallow, and whatever fruit grew behind the house. Now you know what American ranches forgot. Share this with anyone who remembers when dessert meant something homemade.